Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. No wooden stable, no snow, no silent night. And the world he entered wasn't waiting with wonder. It was rotting with corpses. When Jesus was a toddler in Galilee, the roads near his village were lined with crosses. Not symbols, not metaphors. Actual crucifixion crosses, thousands of them, displaying the bodies of Jewish rebels Rome had executed after a failed uprising. They hung there for weeks, decomposing, picked apart by birds. A deliberate display of what happened when you challenged the empire. This was the first landscape Jesus knew, not shepherds and angels, blood and terror. The Jesus you've heard about in church, the gentle teacher in flowing robes, speaking in soft parables. That's not the whole story. It's not even half of it. The real Jesus was a construction worker from a village so insignificant it doesn't appear in any historical record outside the Bible. He hauled stone in the desert heat for decades. His hands were calloused. His back bore the scars of manual labor. He spoke 3 languages because survival in an occupied land required it. He built homes for the wealthy while living in poverty himself. And when he finally stepped into public life, he didn't preach safety. He preached revolution, the kind that gets you executed. This is the Jesus who made Rome nervous, the one who built a following from tax collectors and terrorists, the one who walked into Jerusalem knowing exactly what waited for him. The one who died the most brutal death the ancient world had designed. This is the real story, beyond the traditions, beyond the Christmas cards, beyond the stained glass. This is Jesus in the world as it actually was. The year is 4 BC. Herod the Great has just died, and Galilee is burning. Rebellions erupt across Judea as different factions fight for power, challenge Roman authority, try to break free from decades of occupation. In Sepphoris, a city just 4 miles from the village of Nazareth, Jewish rebels seize the armory and declare resistance. Rome's response is immediate and absolute. The governor of Syria, Varus, marches legions south. They retake Sepphoris, burn it to ash, and sell the survivors into slavery. But burning one city isn't enough. Rome needs to send a message that every person in Galilee will understand. So they crucify 2,000 men, not in one place, along the roads, the main routes where travelers walk, where families pass, where children play. Josephus, the Jewish historian who recorded this, doesn't soften the details. The crosses went up in clusters, bodies displayed where they'd have maximum visibility. This is the Galilee where Jesus grows up. He would have been a toddler when this happened, too young to understand, but old enough to see. And the crosses didn't come down quickly. Crucifixion victims were left to rot as warnings. For weeks, maybe months, those roads carried the smell of death. By the time Jesus was old enough to walk those roads himself, the crosses might have been gone. But the memory wasn't. Every adult in Nazareth had seen it. Every family knew someone who'd been killed. The violence wasn't ancient history. It was recent trauma, the kind that shapes how you see power, how you talk about resistance, how you raise your children. Crucifixion wasn't rare in this world. It was Rome's standard reply to defiance. The empire used it deliberately, not just to kill, but to humiliate and terrorize. Victims were stripped naked, displayed in public, made to suffer for days while crowds watched. It was execution as performance, designed to break not just bodies, but the will to resist. And it was effective. Growing up in Nazareth meant growing up with fear baked into daily life. Roman soldiers patrolled. Tax collectors extracted wealth under threat of violence. Any gathering could be seen as conspiracy. Any strong personality could be viewed as a threat. Jesus didn't grow up in a peaceful, spiritual retreat. He grew up in an occupied war zone, where the consequences of resistance were visceral and unavoidable. This is the environment that formed him. Not angels and miracles, violence and power. And the question every person in Galilee carried: how do you survive under an empire that kills anyone who challenges it? That question would follow Jesus his entire life, and eventually it would kill him the same way it killed those 2,000 men on the roadsides of his childhood. Jesus was not born on December 25th. The date appears nowhere in the Gospels. No early Christian writing mentions it. The choice came centuries later, selected to align with Roman winter festivals, not historical record. Shepherds were in the fields, the Gospel of Luke says, watching their flocks at night. In Judea, shepherds don't keep sheep outdoors in December. Winter is cold, wet, unpredictable. Flocks are sheltered. The detail suggests spring or fall, seasons when shepherds live outside with their animals. The image of the stable is wrong too. The word translated as inn in most Bibles is kataluma, a Greek term that means guest room, not a commercial lodging. Mary and Joseph weren't turned away by an innkeeper. They were likely staying with extended family in Bethlehem, and the guest space was occupied. So the birth happened where animals were kept, not a wooden barn. Judea is limestone country, rocky, harsh, with limited timber. Homes were often built into or beside caves, with the caves serving as shelter for animals at night. Archaeological evidence shows this pattern across the region. Jesus was most likely born in a cave, dark, damp, reeking of manure and urine. Mary was probably between 12 and 15 years old, the normal age for marriage in that culture. A teenager, far from home, in labor without modern medicine, without sterilization, without pain relief. 1 in 5 children died before age 5 in the ancient world. Maternal mortality was constant. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for young women. Mary survived. Jesus survived. Not because the conditions were clean or safe, but because they were lucky. This wasn't a holy night in the sense tradition portrays. It was a desperate, bloody, dangerous event that somehow didn't end in death. And it didn't end safely. Shortly after birth, Herod the Great, paranoid, violent, nearing his own death, ordered the killing of male infants in Bethlehem. The Gospels call it the Massacre of the Innocents. Historians debate whether it happened exactly as described, but it fits what we know of Herod, a man who killed his own sons when he suspected conspiracy. Joseph fled, took Mary and the infant and ran. Not north into Galilee, that was Herod's territory too. South and west into Egypt. The journey was roughly 75 to 100 miles through arid, dangerous terrain. No roads in the modern sense, no infrastructure, limited water sources, bandits, exposure, the constant threat of dehydration. They carried an infant. Mary would have been recovering from childbirth, bleeding, weak, in pain. Joseph would have been carrying supplies, navigating, protecting them. This wasn't a spiritual pilgrimage, it was refugee flight. When they reached Egypt, they became what every refugee becomes: outsiders dependent on the generosity of strangers. Egypt had a large Jewish diaspora, which provided some safety. But they had no home, no income, no stability. Jesus' first months of life were spent in hiding, in exile, in survival mode. Eventually, Herod died. The family returned, not to Bethlehem, but to Nazareth in Galilee, a village so small and poor that the wider world didn't know it existed. This is where Jesus grew up, not in the golden glow of Christmas cards, but in the shadow of violence, displacement, and poverty. The birth narrative isn't about comfort, it's about vulnerability. A teenage mother, a refugee family, a child born into a world that wanted him dead before he could speak. That world wouldn't stop wanting him dead. Nazareth doesn't appear in the Hebrew Bible. It's absent from the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian who documented nearly every significant town in first-century Palestine. The Talmud, compiled over centuries of Jewish scholarship, never mentions it. Outside the Gospels, Nazareth is invisible. When Nathanael hears that Jesus comes from Nazareth in the Gospel of John, his response is immediate. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Not surprised that the Messiah comes from a small town, surprised that anyone notable comes from that town specifically. Nazareth had a reputation. It was the kind of place people forgot existed. Archaeological excavations reveal why. The village during Jesus' time held perhaps 200 to 400 people. Simple stone houses built into hillsides. No public buildings, no synagogue structure from that period. Religious gatherings happened in homes. The economy was subsistence agriculture. Families grew barley and wheat on terraced slopes, kept a few animals, made what they couldn't trade for. Poverty wasn't exceptional. It was structural. But the archaeology reveals something else. Underground chambers, hiding spaces, tunnels carved into bedrock beneath homes. These features appear throughout Galilean villages from this period. They weren't for storage, they were for concealment, places to disappear when Roman patrols came through, when tax collectors arrived with soldiers, when violence erupted and survival meant becoming invisible. Nazareth's architecture is defensive, built by people who expected trouble. Jesus grew up knowing where to hide. Daily life meant physical labor from childhood. By age 5 or 6, children worked, watching animals, hauling water, helping with harvest. By 12, they performed adult tasks. There was no separation between childhood and labor. Survival required everyone's contribution. The work was unrelenting, plowing rocky soil, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, repairing terraces, hauling stones, feeding animals, grinding grain. Most calories came from barley bread, the food of the poor. Wheat was for those with money. Protein came from lentils, chickpeas, occasional fish. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals. Malnutrition was common. Stunted growth, dental problems, infections. Bodies wore out quickly under constant labor and insufficient calories. By modern standards, a 30-year-old manual laborer in Nazareth might appear a decade older. But Nazareth wasn't just poor. It was politically tense. Galilee produced revolutionaries. Judas of Galilee, who led a major revolt in 6 AD. Simon Bar Giora, John of Gishala. The region had a reputation for resistance, for refusing to quietly accept Roman occupation. Heavy taxation fed that anger. Rome extracted tribute. Herod Antipas, the puppet ruler of Galilee, collected taxes for his building projects. The temple demanded its share. A peasant family could lose 30 to 40% of their produce to various authorities. When crop failures hit, families fell into debt. Land was lost. People became day laborers, tenant farmers, beggars. This was the economic reality Jesus knew firsthand. Nazareth wasn't a peaceful village where spiritual wisdom grew naturally. It was a pressurized environment where poverty, occupation, and fear created constant tension. Religious devotion wasn't separate from this reality. It was a response to it. The hope for God's kingdom wasn't abstract theology. It was the desperate prayer of people who had no other hope. Jesus didn't grow up sheltered from the world's brutality. He grew up inside it, shaped by it, carrying it in his body. The forgotten village of nobodies produced a man who refused to stay forgotten. But first, he had to survive it. Jesus wasn't a carpenter. The word used in the Gospels is tekton, a Greek term meaning builder, craftsman, construction worker. Not someone who works exclusively with wood, but someone who builds. And in first-century Galilee, building meant stone. The region is limestone, rocky hills, sparse forests, limited timber. Wood was expensive, reserved for roof beams, doors, essential structures. Everything else, homes, walls, terraces, public buildings, was stone. A tekton in Nazareth quarried rock, shaped it, hauled it, stacked it into walls that would stand for generations. This wasn't craft in the romantic sense, it was hard labor. Limestone blocks weigh 50 to 100 pounds or more. Moving them meant lifting, carrying, dragging. Shaping them meant hammering and chiseling for hours in the sun. The work destroyed hands, calluses splitting into cuts, stone dust embedding in skin, joints wearing down from repetitive stress. Jesus would have started young. By his teens, he was doing the work of a man. By 30, his body carried decades of damage. There's evidence he may have worked beyond Nazareth. 4 miles away, Sepphoris was being rebuilt. After Rome destroyed it in 4 BC, Herod Antipas made it his capital, transforming it into a Greco-Roman showpiece. Paved streets, a theater seating 4,000. Wealthy estates with mosaic floors. The construction required laborers. Nazareth was close enough for daily work migration, men leaving at dawn, returning at dusk. If Jesus worked in Sepphoris, he would have seen wealth up close, built the homes of the powerful while living in poverty himself, constructed luxury for people who would never know his name. The city reflected Roman culture. Greek was spoken in its markets. Architecture followed imperial styles. The theater hosted performances celebrating Roman gods and emperors. Jesus would have been an outsider there, a village laborer whose work made someone else's prosperity visible. That contrast, building for the wealthy, returning to nothing, shapes how someone sees the world. When Jesus later taught about masters and servants, wealth and poverty, those who have and those who don't, he wasn't speculating. He was remembering. The physical toll was constant. Stonework meant injuries, crushed fingers, repetitive strain, chronic pain in shoulders, backs, knees, cuts that didn't heal cleanly. exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. Life expectancy for manual laborers was shorter than for elites. Bodies gave out. A working man at 50 was old. Jesus died at 33. But those 33 years included at least 15 years of construction labor. His body wasn't untouched by the world. It was marked, used, worn down. When he later walked 70 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem, multiple times, he did it with the legs of someone accustomed to walking. When he endured beatings and crucifixion, he did it with a body already hardened by pain. The image of Jesus as gentle, soft, physically unimposing doesn't match the evidence. He was a builder. He worked stone. He knew heat, hunger, exhaustion, and the specific suffering of a body broken by labor. That's the man who eventually stood in front of crowds and said the kingdom of God belongs to the poor. Not as distant theology, as lived truth. Jesus spoke 3 languages, not as an academic exercise, as survival. Aramaic was the language of home, the fields, the family table. It was what peasants spoke to each other, what mothers used with children, what men shouted over construction noise or across harvested rows. Most of Jesus's teaching, later written in Greek, was likely first spoken in Aramaic. The rhythm of his parables, the wordplay, the memorable sayings, they carried the patterns of Aramaic speech. The Gospels preserve fragments. Talitha cum, little girl, get up. Abba, an intimate form of father. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? These weren't translation choices. They were moments too raw, too specific to render in another tongue. Hebrew was different, sacred, formal. It was the language of Scripture. Synagogue readings, religious debate. A literate Jew needed Hebrew to engage Torah, to participate in the interpretive traditions that structured community life. Luke's Gospel shows Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah in a Nazareth synagogue. Not listening, reading. That required literacy in a language most peasants didn't know beyond memorized prayers. Somehow, Jesus learned. Whether through a village teacher, a traveling scribe, or sheer determination, he gained access to the religious language of his people. It gave him authority later, the ability to argue with educated temple officials, to quote text, to reinterpret tradition. Greek was the language of the world beyond. The Roman Empire operated in Greek: commerce, administration, military orders. If you wanted to trade with anyone outside your village, you needed Greek. If you worked in a mixed city like Sepphoris, you needed Greek. The Gospels show Jesus speaking with a Roman centurion, with Pilate, with a Syrophoenician woman. These conversations required a shared language, and it wasn't Aramaic or Hebrew. Jesus didn't just survive in 3 linguistic worlds. He moved between them. He could speak to Galilean fishermen in their own rough dialect, debate Pharisees in liturgical Hebrew, and navigate Roman power structures in functional Greek. That flexibility was rare. It required intelligence, exposure, effort. Galilee itself demanded it. The region wasn't isolated. It sat on trade routes connecting Egypt to Damascus. Merchants, soldiers, travelers passed through constantly, bringing languages, ideas, goods. Nazareth might have been small, but it wasn't sealed off. 4 miles from Sepphoris, a day's walk from larger towns. close enough to the world that the world's complexity touched everything. Jesus encountered Greeks, Romans, Syrians. He saw their wealth, their power, their indifference to people like him. His later teachings show familiarity with both rural life and broader social structures. He knew how landlords exploited tenant farmers, how debtors were crushed by interest, how imperial economics extracted wealth upward while calling it peace. He didn't learn that from Torah study alone. He learned it from living inside the machinery. The multilingual reality also shaped his message. When he spoke of God's kingdom, he used a word, basileia, that had political weight in Greek. Kingdom, empire, reign. It wasn't a safe religious metaphor. It was a direct challenge to Roman claims. In Aramaic, his hearers would have heard echoes of older hopes: God's promised rule, the restoration of Israel, justice for the oppressed. Same message, different resonances depending on who listened. Jesus wasn't speaking into a vacuum. He was speaking into a complex, occupied, multilingual world where every word choice carried risk. He chose his words carefully, and eventually, they got him killed. At 12 years old, Jesus went missing in Jerusalem. His family had traveled south for Passover, a journey of 70 miles on foot, 5 to 7 days through Judea's hills. Thousands made the pilgrimage together, moving in extended family groups for safety. When the festival ended, the caravan left. Mary and Joseph assumed Jesus was somewhere in the crowd, walking with cousins, friends, other families. It was normal. Children weren't supervised the way modern parents supervise. They moved in packs, woven through the traveling group. A full day passed before they realized he wasn't there. Panic, the kind every parent knows. They turned back, retracing miles, scanning faces, asking everyone. 3 days. He'd been gone 3 days when they found him. Not lost, not wandering. In the temple courts, sitting among religious teachers, listening, asking questions, speaking. Luke's gospel records the reaction. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. Not charmed, amazed. A 12-year-old village boy holding his own with Jerusalem's educated elite. Mary's response wasn't pride. It was relief mixed with anger. "Why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been searching for you in anguish." Jesus' answer created distance. "Why were you searching? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Not Joseph's house, his father's. The moment marks something, an emerging identity, a sense of belonging that exceeded family bonds. But then, silence. After this scene, the Gospels give nothing. Jesus returned to Nazareth, Luke says. He was obedient to his parents. He grew in wisdom and stature. And that's all. For 18 years, from 12 to 30, there is no record, no stories, no teaching, no miracles, just absence. These are the hidden years, the gap that every reconstruction of Jesus' life has to navigate. What we can infer: he worked, he lived, he remained unmarried. That last detail matters. Jewish men typically married in their late teens or early 20s. Remaining single past 25 was unusual. By 30, it was conspicuous. Why didn't Jesus marry? Financial inability, Supporting a family required resources he may not have had. Family obligation. If Joseph died early, Jesus, as the eldest son, would support his mother and younger siblings. Personal calling, a growing sense that his life would take a path incompatible with family stability. Whatever the reason, his singleness marked him as different. The hidden years weren't wasted. They were preparation, not dramatic, just long, grinding, ordinary. Work, observation, thought. The slow accumulation of experience that shapes how someone sees the world. Jesus knew physical exhaustion, chronic hunger, the humiliation of poverty, the weight of family responsibility, the boredom of repetitive labor, the ache of a body used hard. He also witnessed political realities. In 6 AD, when Jesus would have been around 12 or 13, Judas of Galilee led a major revolt against Roman taxation. It failed. Rome crushed it, executing leaders and collaborators. Galilee simmered with tension throughout Jesus' 20s. Herod Antipas ruled as Rome's client. The temple authorities in Jerusalem collaborated. Taxes drained peasants. Debt accumulated. Land was lost. The world didn't improve. It ground people down. And somewhere in those years, Jesus made a decision. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually something clarified. The life he was living, building for others, surviving day to day, wasn't the life he would keep living. He began watching a man named John. Jesus walked 70 miles to find him. John had emerged in the Judean wilderness, a prophet wild enough to draw crowds and dangerous enough to worry authorities. He preached repentance, divine judgment, the coming kingdom of God. He called people into the Jordan River and baptized them, a ritual cleansing that signaled readiness for what was next. When Jesus arrived, he wasn't observing. He was participating. He waded into the water, submitted to John's baptism, accepted the role of follower, not leader. The Gospels describe a visionary experience, heavens opening, Spirit descending, a voice declaring Jesus as God's Son. Whatever happened internally, the external act was clear. Jesus aligned himself with John's movement. Then he disappeared, not back to Nazareth, into the wilderness. The Judean desert isn't scenic, it's hostile. Barren limestone hills, no shade, no reliable water. Summer temperatures exceed 100 degrees. Winter nights drop near freezing. Jesus stayed there for 40 days, without food. The human body can survive weeks without eating, but the process is brutal. The first days bring intense hunger. Then it fades as the body shifts into starvation mode, consuming its own fat and muscle for fuel. Energy drops. Thinking becomes difficult. Weakness makes movement exhausting. Dehydration amplifies everything. If he had water, survival was possible. Without it, he'd have died in days. The Gospels say he was tempted by Satan. 3 specific offers. Turn stones to bread. Throw yourself from the temple and be saved by angels. Worship me and receive all the kingdoms of the world. These can be read as external spiritual warfare or internal psychological struggle. Either way, the structure is the same. Jesus faced choices about what kind of Messiah he would be. The first temptation, bread from stones, addressed immediate physical need, the power to solve hunger, to meet material desperation. Jesus refused. The second, spectacle, a miraculous sign that would compel belief, offered proof, certainty, the kind of demonstration that removes doubt. Jesus refused. The third, political power, control over nations, offered the conventional path to change. Dominance, force, the method every other revolutionary used. Jesus refused. When he emerged from the wilderness, he'd made decisions. He wouldn't coerce, wouldn't perform to compel belief, wouldn't seize power by force. What remained was harder, slower, more dangerous. He returned to Galilee and began calling others. The first were fishermen, Peter and Andrew, casting nets. James and John, mending equipment. Working men with no formal religious training, no credentials, no reason anyone would listen to them. Jesus didn't ask for resumes. He said, "Follow me." They left their boats. Matthew came next, a tax collector, the kind of man fishermen despised, a collaborator who extracted money for Rome, skimming profit from his own people's suffering. Jews considered tax collectors ritually unclean, morally contaminated. Inviting one into a religious movement was scandalous. Jesus invited him anyway. Then Simon, called the Zealot. That label mattered. Zealots weren't pacifists. They were revolutionaries, committed to violent resistance against Rome. Some carried concealed daggers and assassinated collaborators in crowds. Simon believed in killing Romans. Matthew worked for them. Jesus put them in the same group. Judas Iscariot joined too. The name Iscariot might link him to the Sicarii, urban assassins who targeted Romans and collaborators. If true, Judas expected revolution. Instead, he got parables. The group wasn't harmonious. The Gospels preserve their arguments. Who's greatest? Who sits where in the coming kingdom? Who gets authority? These were real men with egos, fears, conflicting expectations. Peter was impulsive, constantly speaking before thinking. Thomas doubted. James and John jockeyed for status. Judas grew disillusioned enough to betray. This wasn't a polished team. It was a volatile coalition held together by one man's vision. And that vision wasn't yet clear to them. Jesus didn't explain everything. He taught in parables, stories that required interpretation. He spoke about seeds and soil, lamps and bushels, treasures and pearls. He blessed the poor, the meek, those who mourned. None of it sounded like military strategy. The disciples followed anyway. Not because they understood, but because something about Jesus made leaving impossible. He had authority, not the authority of priests or scholars. Those came from institutions. His was personal, direct. When he spoke, people felt the weight of it. And he kept moving, village to village, synagogue to hillside, wherever crowds gathered. He healed, cast out demons, challenged Sabbath rules, ate with sinners. Every act was a provocation. Every teaching pushed boundaries. And slowly, the attention grew. Crowds, controversy, hope, threat. The authorities began watching. Jesus began his public work by submitting to baptism. He walked into the Jordan, accepted John's ritual, and emerged changed, not in essence, but in clarity. Then he vanished into the wilderness for 40 days. No food, only thirst, heat, isolation. His body consumed itself. His mind broke open under deprivation. When he returned, he had made choices about power, how to use it, how to refuse it. He would not coerce belief, would not seize political control, would not solve problems through force. What remained was harder and more dangerous. He began gathering followers, fishermen, a tax collector, a revolutionary. Men who had no reason to trust each other, held together only by him. This wasn't a movement yet. It was a gamble. 2,000 years later, we're still trying to understand him. The construction worker who challenged empires, the poor man who redefined power, the executed criminal whose followers changed the world. History doesn't offer miracles as evidence, but it offers transformation. And that transformation started here, in stone dust and occupied roads, with a man who chose the hard way.